have any inner relationships with the Chinese women, except for the ones that were assigned to escort them to different things. And then those women that they did meet with were absolutely, you guys are ridiculous. There's no such thing as rights. Because as far as the Chinese are concerned, they don't have this social contract theory as part of their software running on their necktops, and they don't believe it. There's no such thing, right? And that's actually the case in many of the countries of the world that haven't been influenced by this kind of social contract theory. They just don't believe it, and in fact, it's not part of their culture. Talk about Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran, where women would love to have rights, kind of rights that people have in the countries like the United States and Europe, where women have rights, and they would love to have that same kind of thing, but no, it's not allowed under Sharia law or whatever interpretation they make of the Quran and how people are supposed to live, right? Male is supposed to be the dominant member. Women aren't allowed outside, and if you are, you have to be draped completely. One of my favorite pictures is a picture of about 4 or 5 women, all with burqas on, with just this little area, and they're all posing for a family picture. It's just so there. So social contract theory. I think we also say they're inalienable. And we get that, of course, from this guy, right? And in fact, I remember they arguing over how do you spell it, inalienable or unalienable. I forget how they ended up deciding to do it. I think it's inalienable, isn't it, in the Declaration? They're familiar with John Locke, whose theory they are accepting completely. Notice, though, in their letter, their declaration to the King, George, they say, we're the ones with the rights, right? We have the same rights. And the King is like, what? Who gave them rights? I didn't. If you have any rights, it's from me. I give people rights, because of course this social contract theory was not something that was accepted by absolute monarchs or even limited monarchs. Right? You still get authority from above. And so we end up with really the United States being the first social contract theory government experiment. This is, as Abe Lincoln says at Gettysburg, right? This is that experiment, right? That a people, by the people, for the people, can survive, right? Can it? I'm going to leave this up because another aspect of this is toleration. Remember, I mentioned that when John Locke lived in Amsterdam, he became familiar with the recently dead work of Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, and what impressed him was, I think, a lot of things, but at the same time, was the argument that he gave for religious toleration. We're all going to be scientists. Scientists are all going to end up coming to agreement on where forces in the universe come from, etc. And once that happens, we won't have all these religious wars anymore. It'll be over. So let's just respect everyone meantime and put up with it, because they're not as educated as we are for the moment. But once we get a chance and they become educated, you'll see we'll just all be one big happy family, so to speak. That's their thinking, I suppose, right? And so we need to be tolerant of other religions. Notice that that's something that Thomas Jefferson picked up on, and if we just, I'll just look directly for it. Why this is dated 1998, 1802. Okay, that's correct. Jefferson is definitely inspired by. And there's a very specific reason why it's a concern, because Virginia at the time was Church of England. And in order for you to be in government in that state, this is the state prior to and somewhat after the Declaration and the War of Independence, that is, you have to be Anglican, you have to be a Church of England member in order to be in our state government. And Jefferson, who was an American deist by then, thought, well, no, we need to have all Virginians that are literate plantation owners, male. Be careful, we talk about, we the people, who they were talking about, we now, I think, are all aware that they were thinking about men like themselves in the room, who have property, who are literate, and of that sort. Those are the citizens that are the ones who have rights, and that they were doing a social contract for. In fact, I think I mentioned that Locke's third indicated right was property. And there's, by the way, a really interesting explanation of how that property and what that property meant for Locke, probably, on the web. And they initially were writing property, and then there was a dispute among the men, and they changed it to pursue happiness, because they didn't want to make sure, wanted to make sure that they weren't offering the right to property to everyone, because, well, whose property are they going to get, right? And when you look at Locke and his explanation of what property is and how you get it, it kind of bugs me. The guy that goes to the apple tree and picks the apple has done the work, which has given him the apple. And so it's his apple. And I'm thinking, well, what if it wasn't his tree? Right? Isn't there a problem there? Because the guy that owns the tree hasn't done that work yet, though he might have planted the tree, right? Nursed the tree, etc. But since he didn't pick the apple, how come this guy who just, wanders by and picks the apple can now claim that apple as his rightful property because he picked it, right? It just seems problematic to me. By the way, I did pick apples for one summer as a job. So I learned how to put the incredibly tall ladder into the tree and climb up in the ladder on the tree and fill your thingy with apples and come down and go and drop them all into the big bin and then go back up and pick more apples. I did that for a summer. Very interesting. In Westchester, Pennsylvania. But it does get into slavery and what slavery is, and so here's where Locke argues with Hobbes and others. Besides showing that the best narrative is a state of nature where we form a social contract, the problem is Locke forms a social contract that just leads right to King Charles II. Absolute monarch is the best form of government for Thomas Hobbes. Not so, says John Locke, because in the state of nature, it's not really nasty, brutish, and short. It's not really a dog-eat-dog world. It's a lot of social people that are living according to the laws of nature. And I don't think we did very much with the laws of nature or the laws of warfare when we were covering Thomas Aquinas. But he's drawing on that source, that there are all these natural laws that we all feel because we're living in God's creation, and God gave us these intuitive laws of how we should behave, right? One of them, for example, is that I don't kill myself. I don't do that. I really shouldn't kill others except in self-defense, right? There's. And by the way, as I'm reviewing some of this, I'm thinking of what's going on in Gaza right now. You think, what's going on here? Well, we've got a social contract issue. Are the Gazans members of the social contract? Well, that's, since 1948, that's not what the Israelis have accepted, right? They've not accepted the Arab Muslims as part of the social contract of who a citizen is in Israel, right? Am I understanding that right? Pretty much, right? And they still aren't, right? And so people that live in Gaza don't have those same social contract rights. And yet, from a world perspective, because we do have the social contract theory in the UN, right? And that was, who knows who did that? The UN.
About the charter, or
it was Roosevelt, not FDR, but Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Let's see, UN Bill of Rights. And lots of countries are signatories to this, and yet at the same time they don't really seem to respect it, because of course if they're a culture like China, who's a signator, but they totally interpret the idea of rights from a different point of view, right? And so you end up then with it not really working. It's just like so much of the UN, it looks really beautiful on paper, but when in practice, the UN has no power to enforce it, etc. Right? But Eleanor, I'm remembering her name right. All right, I'm old. Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Yeah, she sat a bunch of people around the table and basically came up with this. So if we're thinking about someone important, really, and that was after FDR had died, that she had done this. So she was still very important in the work she did. And I wanted to mention this guy, because if we're thinking about social contract philosophy, we've got John Locke, we've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Don't go that way. By the way, when you're in the cocktail party and someone mentions John Locke, I suggest the best phrase to use is tabula rasa. It's a John Locke phrase, tabula rasa, which means an erased table, which is, in this case, a whiteboard. Right? You could put a table on the wall and you could write on chalk. That's where the table comes from, right? It's a table on the wall, right, that you could write on, but it's erased when you're born, for John Locke. So when we come into the world as children, we're just as Thomas Hobbes described, we're blank slates, and we get started with all the incoming sensory inputs that then create the ideas, etc. So he's following John Locke that way. It expands on it, but nonetheless. But you think, well, when did social contract theory end? You know, if you go back to John Locke, that's a long time ago. Well, social contract theory still continues. We still have these, of course, arguments